Professor Jen, in the virtual world, Women in Crime, lecturecast number 4. Good evening again. Thank you for letting me be part of your virtual world. A couple things I'm going to discuss tonight, and hope that it gives you some food for thought. I've gotten quite a few emails from many of you that have asked me to talk more about vicarious trauma. And I had an overwhelming amount of requests, which I'm happy to take requests, by the way, for these little lecture casts about life in prison and in jail while I was working there. It seems that many of you would like some, I don't know, tales of the trenches, so I'm happy to provide that for you tonight. Also, I'm going to put up for you this evening, my dears, the literary review that is due April 1. In my Dropbox. Of course, if you're an NTID student or you have a student with special needs, I know who you are. You've already furnished me with your ADA statement. You'll have a week extra to do that assignment. Also, tonight I'm going to be putting up the midterm assignment, which will also be due in my Dropbox April 5th by midnight. And excuse me if I keep looking away from the screen, it's just I'm looking at my notes. And the question for the week is already up for you here to go into my Dropbox for week 11. So we're really on target and on track. So I thought I'd begin with a few little tales as per your request about vicarious trauma. I had mentioned to you that I worked with a police officer at one time who had some circumstances that really upset him, and after these particular events or occasions, he couldn't eat anything that was pink or red because it just reminded him of some brain splatter and some human tissue that he had seen, so that was the end of it for him. Vicarious trauma also happens in other professions, especially those professions that have mandated reporting, such as school teachers, guidance counselors, clinicians, nurses, etc. I'll give you another example of something that I saw in the field that was told to me by another clinician when we were discussing vicarious trauma. I have no personal opinion on what I'm about to tell you, but it is a little distressing. So if you have any kind of issue this evening or whenever you're watching this and you don't feel like being distressed, this does come with a little bit of a graphic warning alert. So now would be a good time to shut me off and move on. So I'll tell you about this particular vicarious trauma activity that my colleague had shared with me. My colleague is a little older than I, and I have known her for about maybe 10 years or so, maybe even a little longer. And she happens to be a head nurse over at Planned Parenthood here in Rochester. And shortly thereafter, this morning after pill came out, which many of you are quite familiar with hearing about it. Apparently it's a particular post-failed birth control pill that one can access and take. Many people, unfortunately, don't understand how to use this kind of medication, and very often very young girls, in fact, usually the young girls, 12, 13, 14 years old, they wind up really trying to consume as many morning after pills and aspirin and all kinds of other over-the-counter medications because they're afraid to still have abortive services or whatever it is that they feel that they need in order to make the decision to terminate their pregnancy. So this clinician friend of mine who's a nurse told me that on numerous occasions, and again this comes with a warning alert, but we are talking about vicarious trauma, so here it is. She said that she would go in the morning very often when the clinic first opened, and she would just do some things around the office, and she said it wouldn't be soon thereafter opening the clinic that she would begin to notice that young girls would be coming in complaining of profuse bleeding from their vaginal area, and then upon discussing it with them, my friend would find out that they took a variety of over-the-counter substances, as well as maybe some vaginal preparations. I'm not going to get too graphic. Anyway, to cause this kind of either premature miscarriage or just to cause the baby or the fetus or whatever you'd like to call it to expel from the body. Therefore, there would be a lot of debris, better known as medical waste, in the toilet. So you say to yourself, well, Jennifer, your friend's a nurse, she's prepared for these things. And she would share with me things that I wasn't even prepared to hear myself, which I'll spare you the details, but that sometimes people were much further along in their pregnancy and they'd attempt to take care of things themselves and then run to Planned Parenthood because they were scared to death because of all the blood that they saw in their underwear, their toilet, or they go through maybe 12 or 15 sanitary pads. This isn't meant to embarrass the men in the class. It's just a fact of nature. Your mother went through the same thing, so there's no reason to be embarrassed. But this use of very large amounts of pads, because what they were doing is basically forcing their body to expel the pregnancies. Anyway, she told me that many a time she would go in the bathroom and she would have to literally flush down the toilet things that, in her opinion, looked very much like small form children. So you talk about vicarious trauma. What do you do at the end of the day from that kind of work? Sometimes she said that she goes into the bathroom herself till this day, and sometimes she sees things in the toilet that just really aren't there. Is my friend suffering from a severe psychological problem? No, but she's traumatized because she saw things that she wasn't really prepared to see in that context, even though she's a nurse. Of course, police officers see and feel a lot of things that have to do with vicarious trauma, especially when it comes to children or persons that are developmentally disabled. I'll give you a case. I can't imagine this past week in Georgia, if you're following the news at all, what it must have been like for the police officers and the ambulance drivers to show up on a call. Apparently there was a woman walking in Georgia with her child in a stroller, and some men had approached her for money and she didn't have any, so they shot the child who was sleeping right in front of her, and the child is dead. So when you're a first responder, whether you're an ambulance driver, a fireman, or a police officer, which very often all three persons from those agencies come at once to an unplanned catastrophic event, how is it that you're trained to deal with these circumstances? You can take all the training in the world, and quite frankly, there are some things that you just can't get out of your mind, hence vicarious trauma. Very often in smaller cities and towns, especially where there are volunteer ambulance services, sometimes there isn't enough caretaking that goes on in the case of vicarious trauma. Sometimes you just go from call to call to call to call, and these people are just like me and you, or your mother and father, or your grandparents. They have daytime or nighttime jobs. They're not professionally trained as careerists, as first responders, but they do it because they have either a loyalty to the community or they just wish to serve their community. I'm happy to report that I too am a member of the Brighton Volunteer Ambulance Corps. Do I care to go out and run around the streets and deal with people? No, because I realize that my days are ended and I have enough vicarious trauma. So what do? When there are hurricanes and things of that nature, I opt to pack the ambulances and get them ready for catastrophic events. So I'm more of a behind-the-scenes person because I realize at this point in the game, I even have too much baggage to go out and deal with people unless I absolutely have to. Another aspect of vicarious trauma can be found when you're sitting to somebody's self-report about their sexual abuse, and you can almost have something called compassion fatigue. In other words, you've listened to so many things that are so horrific that even you're tired of being compassionate. It's that not that you don't want to be compassionate, You're just absolutely exhausted from listening and extending your feelings and empathy to other people. And that's unfortunately what causes a lot of burnout in these kinds of areas of employment. Very often, these areas of employment offer very generous amounts of vacation time, sick time, the proverbial mental health day, and family leave in the event that it just becomes so overwhelming that you can't do it anymore. And then you can take a break and come back. So I want to give you some of these examples of where persons find vicarious trauma. Sometimes in catastrophic events, and it's really quite frequent these days because of all these tragedies, in general, where people do things, they open fire in movie theaters, they go into shopping malls, and they carry what I call domestic terrorism out on their very own people and society. This also, too, causes a lot of vicarious trauma. And in fact, for people that are interested in the field of psychology, I am sorry to say there'll be plenty more jobs available in dealing with persons that are what? Caretakers and vicarious trauma. I also was asked by a few of you if I could recollect a few of my favorite stories of my working in prisons and jails, and I'll give you a few this evening, and then I'll load this up and go about my way and begin to write out for you the assignments that will be creeping up and due very soon as we approach our literary review plus midterm week and so on and so forth. Years ago when I worked in prison, I was very annoyed. I guess you could also say this is a vicarious trauma issue. I had this student, male, and he came into my office and he said, "Mrs. Wolfley, can I borrow a pencil from you?" I'll never forget this. And I said, "Yeah, of course." I mean, I was eager as an educator to give him a pencil. And then he got into a very quick argument with another inmate, and right in front of me he stabbed the inmate in the eyeball. You can imagine how pissed I was, as this really ruined my day. I wasn't planning on going to work and having to deal with this, and I can imagine how painful it was for the other inmate. And we had to get a medical care immediately and section off the area so that it didn't cause more of a melee or a riot. Anyway, later that day I had to go through internal affairs and I had to be interviewed. I can't tell you how many times about who did what and where the pencil came from and what were the preceding factors, precipitating factors, what did I overhear. And these interviews went over and over and over, and it was sort of warm out. And I remember how thirsty I was. And when internal affairs comes to get you to question you, they're not really too concerned, and they don't give a shit if you're thirsty or if you have to go to the bathroom or if you have your period or what your problem is. You don't move from that chair until they're done asking you questions. And that's one of the things you have to consider when you work in a paramilitary environment. And I remember later that afternoon as I wanted to go home, you can imagine how shaken I was, that I literally saw somebody's eyeball come out of their eye and roll around the floor of my office, etc. And I was so disgusted because I felt so betrayed over this pencil. If I'd known that this inmate was going to do this, take this pencil and stab the other guy in the eye right in front of me or anybody else, I would never have given him the pencil. So they put him in a place called the Box, which happens to be a J block seclusion. And I was so pissed, just so pissed. I needed some closure that I remember I said to the sergeant at the time on shift, I said, "I'd like to go visit the stabber in J block because I'm pretty annoyed right now and I need to work this out for myself." And it's sort of funny when you work in prison, especially a male facility, because the men usually wear sneaker bottom shoes, so when they walk you really don't hear much. But most women wear shoes with a heel or something that makes noise, or I guess I did, and the inmates always knew when it was that Mrs. Wolfley was on the deck. That's how they called it in military terms, on deck, because they could hear not only the pace of my walk, but the little sound that the bottom of my shoes made. And I remember this particular inmate, we'll just call him Jose for our purposes. He was all the way at the end of J Block, and I remember walking down J Block. And in prison, if men respect you, they treat you with that respect. If they don't respect you, they have their penis out, they're masturbating in front of you, or they're throwing fecal matter, urinating in front of you. And I remember one of the inmates screamed in J Block, "Mrs. Wolfley's on deck." And I remember you could hear a pin drop, and I didn't see one penis, nothing. And I walked down that J Block as if I was commanding the stage, and I got all the way to the end, and there was Jose, locked up and handcuffed, and he was cowering in the corner because he knew I was coming. And I said, "Jose, I'm so disgusted with you." I said, "How could you ever put me in this position?" I said, "I have to go home now to my family." I said, "And it's something that's going to stay with me for a very long time, what you did in front of me, committing this crime and assault against another person." And he just stood there crying, and he said, "Mrs. Wolfley, if I could have done it another way, I would have, but there was no other way for me, and so that's what I did." And I said, "Do you ever consider that maybe it's going to affect me for the rest of my life?" And he never answered me, but he just continued to cry as if he were a kindergarten child that just got his glue stick taken away. And it wasn't crocodile tears. He really was very emotional. After that, my inmate staff, at the time I had 3 secretaries, they were always very protective, even more so, because I think they realized how much that had affected me, that whole incident, even though I could have taken the next day off as hazardous duty rest from what had happened. I came right back to work. So even my staff, who were inmates, realized that if I was willing to come back to work the next day, that they too had to be maybe a little more hypervigilant, though it wasn't their job, but just to be humane, so I wasn't put in a situation like this again. We had another incident when I worked at Groveland Correctional Facility that's in the news archives. It happened on a Sunday, roughly circa 1994, I believe. And there was a civilian staff person like myself who was working in the kitchen, and she was about my age at the time, in her 30s, had a family. If I remember, she had 3 children and a husband, and part of her job was not only as cooking staff in the prison, but she worked as a vocational education counselor and doing cooking skills in prison. And unfortunately, before it had made the news, I'd heard about it when I'd gone to work that Monday. She had been sequestered in a closet with another inmate and held hostage for roughly 3 hours, and he raped her brutally for the 3 hours that they were locked in this closet. Interestingly, this particular inmate never had a history of sexual violence that was reported, and the reason he was in prison was not for sexual violence. How I had found out is I had gotten to prison, and there was this guard at the gate. His name was Robbie. And Robbie every day would go through my handbag, and he knew more about me personally than my own husband did. He knew when I had my period. He knew everything about me, what I was eating for lunch that day, because they would search the civilian staff very, very carefully so we weren't used as mules by the inmates. Anyway, Robbie had said to me, "Jennifer, did you hear the news at all about what happened in the facility yesterday?" And I said, "No." He said, "Well, I'm really not supposed to say anything because there's a civilian brief at roughly 9:30 in the morning, but I do want to tell you because you're so well liked here by the staff and the inmates that we don't want to catch you off guard so you feel betrayed." I said, "What is it?" And he proceeded to tell me about this rape and hostage situation the day before at the prison of a civilian female just like myself. So I thanked Robbie for telling me, and of course my stomach started doing tumbles and flips. Even though I really didn't know her, I could sort of relate, and all of this is going through my mind. And I walked through the gate and through the key tower and the gun tower and down the corridor and walked out to the door into the main prison yard. I'd come to find out much later in the day, because I'd gone to the prison briefing for civilian staff to discuss what had happened and for people to air out their fears and whatnot. And I remember when I was walking through the prison yard, which had about 300 inmates in it, lifting weights, playing basketball, walking from programs. At that time, that facility housed roughly 2,100 inmates. I remember it was almost as if everybody stopped passing the basketball, and it was so eerie because a lot of the inmates couldn't even look me in the eye, because I'm sure that they realized at that point that I had known what happened the day before. And when I got to my job, so many of the students that I had in my inmate programs and my staff that were inmates, they all said to me, Mrs. Wolfley, you are aware what happened yesterday? And I said, yes, and I'm going to a prison briefing very shortly to understand more of the details, so it saddens me. And all day it was almost as if the inmates were being extra nice to me, though they were always very kind. I only had one issue in prison with one particular inmate who blew me a kiss, and then after I had said to him, you won't do that again, the other inmates had wound up taking care of him, and he wound up coming like a little choir boy 3 days later to apologize to me. Anyway, that whole day, all the inmates kept saying to me, Mrs. Wolfley, we would do anything and everything to circumvent anything ever happening to you here in the facility, but we're very sorry for your friend. So that was one little incident that I sort of never forgot either. But I do have one little county jail story that I would like to tell before I leave you tonight and continue typing what I need to type for you. I worked here in the Monroe County Jail at one point, sometimes twice a week, usually once a week, and I ran two particular groups. One was a peer-driven self-help group for prostitutes that were child sexual survivors of sexual assault, usually incest. And then I ran a poetry program. It was called the Women's Incarceration Poetry Program. And so I was very happy to run these programs. And other times I would teach basic writing and some other little things for resume development. And I remember the guards, I'd say 20% at Monroe County, the deputies were very nice, 20%. And maybe 20% were indifferent. I don't know if they were nice or they weren't nice. And then roughly 60%, let's hope I got my math right, 60% were really rude. And in fact combative and very angry that a civilian would dare to come in and help anybody, because I guess maybe they were worried about job security or whatever, but as we know, the recidivism rates are very high and nobody has to worry about job security. And I remember I really had to pee. I really had to go to the bathroom. If you've ever been there, whether you're a man or a woman and you've held it in long enough and you just really have to pee, you just have to go. There's no apologizing for it. You really have to go. And I kept saying to this female guard deputy, I said, I really need to use the bathroom. And they have very strict rules about using bathrooms in prison and in jail, and especially for obvious reasons in an opposite sex jail, gender, you're not going to go to the bathroom with the inmates. But even in a same-sex situation, they don't want you consorting with the inmate population. I must have asked for 35 minutes to go to the bathroom to expel some urine. But I actually really had to go. I'm not kidding you. It was imperative I had to go. So I must have asked for about 35 minutes, may I use the bathroom, may I use the bathroom, may I use the bathroom, and it got to the point where it was becoming painful. I really had to use the bathroom. But for this particular deputy, it was a power and control issue, and I guess she wanted to show me she was in control, which nobody was arguing, and the bottom line was she had nothing else to do but sit there and watch me ask her to go to the bathroom. Finally, she turned her head to go to the computer after I had asked her again to go to the bathroom. And I don't know what she was doing on there. I don't know if she was playing Sudoku or I have no idea what she was doing, and it really was irrelevant because I had to use the restroom. And finally I decided that I was going to go to the restroom on deck with the other women who were inmates, which there's no privacy. You pee in front of everybody. The toilet tissue's there. You have no privacy. And I said to the inmates that were in the bathroom, because they were a little shocked that I came in, I said, you'll have to pardon me, ladies. It's a female thing. I absolutely have to go. And down went my pants, and I went and did my business, and I was extremely happy. And this particular guard deputy was so annoyed with me, and she said, you really shouldn't have done that. I said, well, you left me with no other option. I really had to go to the restroom. I said, so I took care of it after I've asked you for 35 minutes. It was funny because after that I went to obviously wash my hands and get a paper towel, and I guess the other inmates had so much respect for the fact that I would pee among them that I didn't even have to get my own towel, which in jail terms is pretty big stuff, that you don't have to get your own towel out of the machine, paper towel. And then after that, I never had an issue again asking a deputy if I could go to the bathroom, because I already demonstrated I have no problem doing my business wherever I have to, because if I tell you I have to go, I'd like to go. Which leads us to a closure in this lecture cast called what? That though people have power, it's really not polite to abuse that power, whether it's an inmate, a civilian, or a family member of an inmate. But sometimes it's done all the time because, unfortunately, you have people that go into occupations that just shouldn't be there. And if you're going to look for opportunities for people to deny them going to the restroom so you can feel powerful, this is probably somebody who shouldn't be there. So I leave you with these thoughts. I take all questions. If there's something you would like me to address in the lecture cast specifically, I'm pleased to do so. I was happy to share with you some of these examples this evening that you asked me for. Some of you have communicated to me. Again, this Easter Sunday, 6 o'clock, 2500 Elmwood Avenue. Please let me know if you're coming for Easter dessert. I'd love to see you. And I will get up there for you all the assignments that are coming due as we approach week 5 next week, which is very hard to believe. I thank you again for letting me come into your virtual world and to share with you some of my expertise and experience. I wish you a lovely evening and be well always. Good night to you and stay safe. Bye.